So these environmental issues caused people to realize that we needed to do something with the way that we dealt with our hazardous waste. And they led to the development of lots of hazardous waste laws like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and other things like that. But I also want to talk with you about kind of just the general interest in environmental issues that happened in the United States. So in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s, people realized that the wild areas of the United States were disappearing. And so they started to form organizations to support preserving these beautiful landscapes. The first national park was established in 1916. And they also started to realize that notable animals were becoming extinct, and that led to the development of the National Audubon Society, the National Wildlife Federation, and the Sierra Club. And then in the early to mid 20th century, we had these big environmental disasters occurring. You might have heard of the Dust Bowl, which happened as part of the Great Depression in the 1930s. We also had the Denora smog disaster, where air pollution killed several people. And so this led to the development of environmental regulations. And coming out of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, the Civilian Conservation Corps was developed. And the Civilian Conservation Corps was specifically developed to build lodges in national parks, build interstates, and help address problems like the Dust Bowl. And then we had the post-World War II economic boom, where all the soldiers were coming back from the war and the economy was booming, and we had the development of new chemicals and plastics. And this big economic boom and this technological development is what led to a lot of those environmental disasters that we talked about at the beginning of this lesson. So all of these things led to the creation of the modern environmental movement. In 1962, the book Silent Spring was published, and people think that Silent Spring was really kind of the impetus that helped people realize that we needed to treat our environment different, along with those disasters that I talked about. The EPA was created in 1970. And then in the late 1970s, throughout the 1980s, and into the early 1990s, major environmental laws were passed. So there are a few different environmental philosophies that people talk about. The first one is the preservation philosophy, and this was started by John Muir. And he believes that wilderness should be preserved for future generations as part of our cultural heritage. And so this preservation mentality led to the creation of the National Park Service and the national parks. There is also the concept of conservation, which was started by a man named Gifford Pinchot. And he believed that humans belong in the environment as inhabitants and stewards. So we should not keep wildlands completely wild. We should be able to receive services from them like logging or water use. However, we need to make sure that we do that in a way that conserves them for future generations for their use as well. Not preserves them as wild places, but conserves them for human use for the future. He believed that humans and nature can happily coexist, and that we need to care for the land, but the land is there to provide services for humans. And then finally, there's the land ethic from Aldo Leopold. And what that believes is that just like we need to treat humans and animals ethically as living beings and living creatures, we also need to treat the land that way. The land we should look at as a living thing that is deserving of fair and honorable treatment, just like humans and animals. So if you want more information about Aldo Leopold, you can click right here on this link. So how do environmental laws and policies get passed? If you guys remember Schoolhouse Rock, you may not. You can click on this link right here, and it's a fun little video about how how a bill becomes a law. But I'm going to talk about that for a few minutes too. So we had all these issues arise, and people started saying that they wanted environmental laws and regulations passed. So they bring those laws or regulations to their congressman or to their senator, and their senator or congressman introduces that law, to be considered as a bill. So it's introduced as a bill. Once the bill is passed by both houses and signed by the president, then the bill becomes a law. But just by the bill becoming a law, it can't automatically solve all those problems. The requirements of the law need to be implemented. And so those requirements are implemented through agencies. So most environmental laws are implemented through the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. So EPA looks at that law, and then it determines how it's going to achieve it through rules and regulations. And those rules and regulations talk about how much diesel exhaust a school bus can emit, or how much air pollution a factory can emit, or how many volatile organic compounds can be in a can of paint. So they try to take those laws and implement them through rules and regulations. So EPA creates those rules and regulations, and then states and local agencies implement those rules and regulations on the local level. So they're essentially the boots on the ground that are going out and making sure that those laws are in effect and people are following them and they are being enforced. I also want to note that state and local agencies can be more stringent and more restrictive than federal regulation. So essentially, federal regulation is the baseline standard, and then states and local agencies can be more restrictive if they feel like they need to. So there are a couple of different ways that these laws can be put into effect. Different options, I should say. The first is the command and control option, and this basically says you will do this. You will follow this requirement. And they direct agencies to specify the details. So right here where you see NAAQS, that stands for National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So these are regulations that say that the concentration of certain pollution in the air cannot exceed a certain level. And if that level is exceeded, there are actions that states and local governments must take to get that concentration below acceptable levels. So that is a command and control policy option. You can also use what are called market-based policies. So these are things that use incentives to reduce the generation of pollution or the use of raw materials. So an example of this is the cap and trade acid rain program. So basically what it does is it says there's only a certain amount of sulfur dioxides that are allowed to be emitted within the United States. And every ton that you emit costs a certain amount of money. And so companies are given the amount that they can emit, and they can either emit that or sell it to other people who want to emit more. And so giving that financial incentive encourages them to reduce their emissions. So those are market-based policies. So we find that within the world of public policy, there's what we call the public policy life cycle. So this is where we start to recognize that there's a problem. And so those environmental disasters that we talked about, and the, realizing that animals were going extinct and we were running out of our wild places, those things happen in the recognition stage. The formulation stage is when people start to talk to their congressmen about it and their senators about it, and they start to introduce bills and talk about how we're going to resolve this issue. The implementation stage is when those bills become a law and those laws generate regulations that are then implemented and people have to follow them. And once we realize that those laws have been on the books for a long time, they just become a part of our day-to-day process, then we get into the control stage where everybody's doing what they need to and it's just a natural part of life. So that is how we kind of got to the point where we need to conduct phase 1 site assessments, because all those environmental disasters helped us to realize that there was a problem. Laws were put into place to solve those problems, and now those laws are part of our day-to-day life. So you'll see that this slideshow here talks about this in more detail. So the recognition stage is when we realize that there's a problem. The formulation stage is when we start to develop those laws. The implementation stage is when those laws become regulations and people are working under those new requirements. And the control stage is when those requirements are an everyday part of our life. So now, phase 1 site assessments are an everyday part of our life.